I think there's something in here that's not a nettle. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. It's Lucy. Today I'm really excited because I'm gonna show you how to make nettle pesto. So right now where I live in the Okanagan in British Columbia, Canada, it's nettle season. And so I took a walk about 2 days ago to one of my favorite parks, and there is this awesome nettle patch there that I discovered about a year ago. And the nettles are just starting to pop up, so they're still like really small, and that's actually the perfect time that you want to harvest nettles, because when they're young and tender they have really good flavor and they have the least amount of stinging properties. So this is what I was able to gather on my expedition. This is quite a lot of nettles. I probably gathered this over, I would say, about half an hour of picking. And just a tip, if you've never picked nettles before, I just like to pick off the tops because they're the very youngest, most tender leaves, and that leaves the rest of the plant to continue growing. When the plants are really small, it's really easy, if you're picking just with one hand, to actually pull the whole plant out of the ground. And I forgot scissors when I went, and this is actually what happened to me. So I would recommend having gloves, of course, to protect you from the stings, and scissors to just chop off the tops of the plants. If you don't have a lot of nettles where you're gathering, you can also just take individual leaves off of the plant, but I always make sure that I don't rip up the whole plant so that it continues making more nettles for other people and for nature. Let's get to making nettle pesto. So the first thing that you have to do is to remove the stinging properties from the nettles so that they don't sting your mouth, obviously, when you eat them. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to blanch them, and this means that I'm just going to soak them in hot water for about 1.5 minutes. So I'm just going to put them into a glass bowl. I think there's something in here that's not a nettle. So I've actually gone ahead and filled up a bowl with cold water because we don't actually want to cook the nettles. We just want to remove the stinging power from them. So once they've blanched, I'm going to move them over into the cold water so that stops the cooking process. So I just heated up my kettle, and I'm just going to pour the hot water over the nettles. Just a tip also, when you're harvesting nettles, that there are other plants that look like nettles but aren't nettles. One of them is called dead nettle, and I think there's a few others. You just want to make sure that if you think it's nettle, that it actually is. And the way that I check is I always just touch one of the leaves, and if I get stung, then I know it's real nettle. I'm just going to make sure that all of the nettles are submerged in the water. And it's cool because as soon as you put the hot water on them, they take on this really cool bright green color. And you'll notice that it's mostly leaves in here. It's not a lot of stems, which is good because if you put a lot of stems into your pesto, unless you have a very high-powered, very good food processor or blender, then you're going to have little bits of stem in your pesto, and that can just completely ruin the texture of it and make it really unpleasant. I always make sure to not have a lot of stems. If there are pieces like this one right here, I'll probably just end up removing that by hand. My nettles have been in the water now for about 90 seconds, so I'm just going to use this slotted spoon and move it over into a bowl of cold water. Okay, so my nettles have been in the bowl for a little bit and they've cooled down. So I'm just going to strain them now to get rid of as much of the water as possible. As you can see, I can touch them now and I'm not getting stung at all. And I like to take this time to also just remove any of the big stemmy pieces that might create a rough texture inside of the pesto. It's kind of cool or strange that you can start off with this huge bag of nettles, and once you're done with this process, you don't actually have that much. Okay, so this is now what I'm left with after that whole thing, and I'm just making sure that there's no twigs or bits of other plants in here before I put it in my bowl. Okay, so now I'm just going to transfer the nettles into a bowl, and because it's really not that much and I would like to make a nice big batch of pesto, I'm going to add in some other greens, and this is the part where you can add in any greens that you have on hand. So you could add in kale or arugula or mustard greens if you want a bit of a peppery taste. I'm just going to add in some claytonia, which is also called miner's lettuce, and it's a local green that grows wild here and people also cultivate it, and it grows really well in shady environments. It has just a neutral taste, so it's just going to add a bit of bulk to the pesto. And I actually really love growing this in my own garden. And I also had some parsley that I wasn't using and I didn't want it to go bad, so I'm just going to throw that in there too. Now I'm going to show you some of the other ingredients that we're going to need for the pesto. What we're going to need is some acid. So I have a lime here, and if that's not enough, I'm also going to add in some raw apple cider vinegar. This is from Bragg, which is a really good brand. You're going to need some salt, some pepper, some extra virgin olive oil, and then I'm making this pesto vegan, so I'm going to use nutritional yeast. I almost forgot walnuts. So I don't really like pine nuts, and pine nuts are also pretty expensive. So instead of pine nuts, I'm just going to use walnuts. Now is the part where you just put everything into the blender, and it just takes a few minutes from raw ingredients to pesto. So let's get blending. The first step for me is I just want to break down the greens a little bit before I start adding in a lot of the other ingredients. So I'm just going to put those in. I'm just going to mix them with a little bit of olive oil. Okay, so I've pulsed it and the leaves have broken down a little bit. And I actually think I forgot to mention this ingredient, which is garlic, which is super important. I'm going to add that in, and I'm going to add in my other ingredients as well. I don't really use a recipe, I just kind of eyeball it. I find that pesto is really forgiving, and different people like different flavor profiles in pesto. Like some people like it to be more nutty, and some people don't like adding a lot of nuts. Some people prefer to add soup stock or water instead of a lot of oil. So I really just eyeball it, and the texture and the taste tells me if I need to add something differently. I'm just gonna add in my acid, which is my lime. I'm also gonna start with about half a teaspoon of sea salt, and then add more to taste, and some pepper. Bit more olive oil. I like a lot of oil. A bunch of this nutritional yeast. Splash of Bragg's apple cider vinegar, and some walnuts. now I'm just gonna blend the devil out of it. So you just have to pause periodically and scrape down the sides of your food processor with a spatula to make sure that everything incorporates evenly. You'll probably have to do that a few times. And if you see that your pesto is too dry, you can always just add more oil or more stock, like veggie stock, or even water. So now that I've blended it and scraped it down and taste tested it a few times, the whole process took me about 3 to 4 minutes. I've reached a consistency that I like. It's still a tiny little bit chunky, I would say. It's not a completely uniform color, but that's actually how I like it. And I think I'm gonna stop here. It's tasting really good. So now the pesto is done, and I'm just gonna transfer it into a mason jar. And I really love to use the pesto as a pasta sauce and also in sandwiches. I think we're probably gonna use all of this pesto within the next week and a half, I would say. If there's any extra, you can always freeze it and then just use it later down the road. I always tell myself I'm gonna make a giant batch and freeze a bunch, but then I always forget how much the leaves shrink down in the process. So I always end up making about 1 mason jar's worth in one session. So yeah, I'm just gonna transfer it. There it is, there's the nettle pesto. And it took, I would say, all in all about 10 minutes to make it. And then it will probably take about 10 minutes to wash all the parts of the food processor that I used. So all in all, it's about a 20-minute process, plus the foraging for the nettles. But I find that to be a really fun activity. Nettles grow in so many different parts of the world, so I encourage you to see if there's any nettles or any other wild greens to make pesto with in your community. And feel free to share your recipes and stories of making pesto with foraged greens down below in the comments. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!